Chapter 9, in which Therandril is a dreadful nuisance, and Cimorene casts a spell. The rest of the trip home was uneventful. Passing through the king's cave seemed easier going in the opposite direction, and the impenetrable darkness only descended once. As soon as they arrived, Kazul took the book Morwen had lent them and curled herself around a rock just outside the mouth of the cave to study it, while Cimorene made dinner. She pored over the book all evening, and Cimorene found it fascinating to watch the dragon delicately turning pages with her claws. Early the next day, Kazul went off to consult with Roxim. Cimorene was rather stiff from all the dragon riding she had done the previous day, so she decided not to do any more cleaning. Instead, she spent the morning looking in Kazul's treasure room, sorting through likely-looking bottles and jars for those who might possibly contain powdered hen's teeth. Remembering Kazul's advice, she started by setting aside all the bottles she could find that had lead stoppers. Since the light was not very good, she took the jars and bottles that looked as if they might be worth investigating and piled them in her apron so as to carry them outside more easily. She had nearly finished sorting when she heard a voice calling faintly in the distance. "Bother," she said. "I did hope they'd leave me alone a little longer." She bundled the last 5 bottles in her apron without looking at them, and, not forgetting to lock the door behind her, hurried out through the maze to see who was shouting for her this time. It was Therandril. "What are you doing here?" Cimorene said crossly. "I told you I wasn't going to be ready to be rescued for at least a month." "I was worried," Therindril said. "I heard that you'd broken a leg, but you look fine to me." "Of course I haven't broken a leg," Cimorene said. "Where did you get that idea?" "Some night at the inn at the foot of the mountain," Therandril replied. "He was up yesterday, talking to the princes he'd been trying to rescue, and he came back and warned everyone not to bother with the princess that was captured by the dragon Kazul. Well, I knew that was you, so I asked why, and he said his princess told him you'd broken your leg and wouldn't be able to walk for months." Cimorene smiled slightly. Eleonora had apparently gone through with her plan to tell Helena about Cimorene's twisted ankle, and Helena had decided to improve the story a little in hopes of reducing the competition. "Somebody must have gotten mixed up," Cimorene said gently. "You can stop worrying. I'm fine. Is that all you came for? These jars are getting heavy, and I've got work to do." "Cimorene, we have to talk," Therandril said in a heavy, deep voice. "Then we'll do it while I work," Cimorene declared. She turned on her heel and marched into the kitchen, full of annoyance. She had been feeling almost friendly towards Therandril. He had been worrying about her, after all, until he said he wanted to talk. Cimorene was quite sure that what he wanted to talk about was rescuing her, and she was annoyed with him for being so stupidly stubborn and annoyed with herself for being annoyed when he was only trying to do the best he could. Therandril followed her into the kitchen. "What is all that?" he asked, as Cimorene put the apron full of jars on the kitchen table and began lining them up. "Some things I'm checking for Kazul," Cimorene said. She picked up a small jar made of a carved jade and pried the lid off. It was half full of green salve. Cimorene put the lid back on and set the jar aside. "What was it you wanted to talk about?" she asked, reaching for another jar. "You. Dragons. Us. That looks interesting. Can I help?" "As long as you don't break anything," Cimorene said. "Some of these are very fragile. Maybe opening jars would make him forget about you, dragons, us, for a while." "I'll be very careful," Therindril assured her. "This one looks like metal. I'll start with that, shall I?" He picked up one of the larger jars, made of beaten copper with 2 handles. He frowned at the top, then reached for his dagger as he tilted the jar. Cimorene saw that the neck was stopped up with a lead. "No, not that one," she said quickly. She didn't remember picking out that particular jar. It must have been one of the last 4 or 5 that she'd scooped up when she heard Therandril calling. Why not? Therandril said, sounding rather hurt. I said I'd be careful. The tip of his dagger was already embedded in the lead. Kazul said to leave the ones with the lead stoppers alone, Cimorene said, so put it back. If you insist, Therandril said, shrugging. He pulled at his dagger, but it was stuck fast in the lead. Drat, he said, and twisted the handle. The dagger came free, and the lead stopper came along with it. I should have known, Cimorene said, in a resigned tone. A black cloud of smoke poured out of the jar. As Cimorene and Therindril watched, it condensed into a dark-skinned giant, wearing only a turban and a loincloth. He was more than twice as tall as Therindril, and the corners of his mouth were turned down in a stern frown. "What is it?" whispered Therindril. "Trouble," said Cimorene. "Thou speakest truly, O daughter of wisdom," said the giant, in a booming voice that filled the cave. "For I am a jinn who was imprisoned in that jar, and I am the instrument of thy death and that of thy paramour." "My what?" Cimorene said, outraged. "Thy lover," the jinn said uncomfortably. "The man who stands beside thee." "I know what you meant," Cimorene said, "but he isn't my lover or my fiancé or my boyfriend or anything, and I refuse to be killed with him." "But Cimorene, you know perfectly well," Therandril started. "You hush! You've made enough of a mess already." "If he is not thy paramour, nor any of those other things, then what is he?" the jinn asked, suspiciously. "A nuisance," Cimorene said, succinctly. "Cimorene, you're not being very kind," Therandril said. "What he matters is not," the jinn said grandly, after a moment's heavy thought. "It is enough that thou and he shall die." "Enough for whom?" Cimorene said. The jinn blinked at her. For me. 'Tis my last will that thou and he shall die by my hand. Thou hast but to choose the manner of thy death." "Old age," Cimorene said promptly. "Mock me not. Thou and he shall die, and by my hand, ere this day draws to its close," the jinn cried. "Do you suppose he means it?" Therandril said nervously. "Why would he keep bellowing it at us if he didn't mean it?" Cimorene said. "Do be quiet, Therandril." Therandril lowered his voice. "Should I offer to fight him, do you think?" "Don't be silly," Cimorene said. She saw that Therandril was distressed, so she added, "You came up here to fight a dragon. You aren't prepared for a jinn, and nobody could reasonably expect you to challenge him." "If you say so," Therandril said, looking relieved. Cimorene turned back to the jinn and saw that he, too, was looking perturbed. "What's the matter with you?" she said crossly. Does thou not want to know why I will kill thee?" the jinn asked plaintively. "What difference does it make?" Cimorene said. "Yes, actually," Therandril said at the same time. "Therandril!" Cimorene said in exasperation. "Shut up! Hear my story, O luckless pair," the jinn said, with evident relief. "I am one of those jinn who did rebel against the law of our kind, and for my crimes I was sentenced to imprisonment in this bottle until the day should come when human hands would loosen me. As is the custom of my people, I swore that those whoso should release me during the first 100 years of my imprisonment, I would make ruler of the earth. Whoso should release me during the second 100 years, I should make rich beyond all dreams of men. Who shall release me during the third 100, I should grant 3 wishes, and whoso should release me after any longer span of time, I should grant only the choice of what death he would die." "You're going to kill us because it's traditional?" Cimorene asked. "Yes," the jinn said. His eyes slid away from Cimorene's, and she frowned suddenly. "Just how long were you in that jar?" she demanded. Well, actually," the jinn's voice trailed off. How long? Cimorene insisted. 217 years, the jinn admitted. But nobody ever releases a jinn before the 300 years are over. You're trying to get around your oath, Therandril said, plainly shocked by the very thought. You pretended you had to kill us so you wouldn't have to give us the wishes. No, the jinn said. Thinkest thou that the granting of wishes alone would so trouble me? Needs must I kill thee and thy fair companion, for I cannot return home and say that thou didst release me, and I left thee living. I would be a laughing-stock. Never in 3,000 years has such a thing occurred. Then you shouldn't have sworn an oath, Therandril said sternly. I had to, the jinn said miserably. It is the custom of our kind. 'Twould be improper, Cimorene muttered. 'Twould be improper to do so otherwise, the jinn said, nodding. But now thou hast found me out, and what am I to do? If I kill thee, it will violate my oath. If I kill thee not, the remainder of my life will be torment. You could go back in the jar for another 83 years, Cimorene suggested delicately. I could go back? The jinn blinked at her for a moment. I could go back! I could go back! And in 83 years, we'll both be dead of old age, Cimorene said. Since that was my choice of death, your oath will be fulfilled, and you can go straight home without killing anyone else, or giving them any riches or power or anything. Truly, thou art a jewel among women, and the very queen of wisdom's daughters, the jinn said happily. Thou hast found the perfect solution to my difficulties. Wait a minute, Therandril said. What about those wishes? Therandril, Cimorene said in a shocked tone. I'm surprised at you. How can he give us wishes if he's going back in the jar for 83 years? They wouldn't be right at all. Therandril frowned. Are you sure? After all, we did let him out during his 300 years. I suppose I could let thee have one wish, at least, in token of my thanks for thy help, the jinn said, as long as thou dost not tell anyone. I wouldn't dream of it, Therindril assured him. And my wish is to defeat a dragon and win his princess's hand in marriage. The jinn waved a dark hand over Therindril's head. There, when thou dost fight a dragon, thou shalt certainly defeat him. And thou? He said, turning to Cimorene. I could use some powdered hen's teeth, Cimorene said. The jinn blinked in surprise, but waved his hand again, his face a mask of concentration. Then he bowed and handed Cimorene a fat brown jar. There's thy desire. Farewell! With an elaborate salaam, the jinn dissolved back into a cloud of smoke that poured back into the copper jar from which it had come. Cimorene leaned over and plucked the lead stopper from the end of Therandril's knife. She jammed it back into place and heaved a sigh of relief. Therandril was not paying attention. Why did you want something like that for? He asked, looking at the jar of hen's teeth and wrinkling his nose in distaste. I don't believe I shall tell you, Cimorene said, putting the jar carefully into one of her apron pockets. It has nothing to do with you. Nothing to do with me? I like that, Therandril said indignantly. I'm going to marry you just as soon as I beat that dragon of yours. I don't think you're going to beat Kazul, Cimorene said in a considering tone. But the jinn just said, he said, that if you fight a dragon, you'll defeat him. But Kazul is a her, not a him, Cimorene pointed out. And you ought not to be trying to rescue me anyways. Why not? Therandril asked, truculently. Because there are other princesses who've been captives of dragons for much longer than I have, and they have seniority, Cimorene explained. Oh, said Therandril, looking considerably taken aback. How do you know? They came to visit and told me all about it, Cimorene said. I think you should try for Caradwell. She's from the kingdom of Raxwell, and her hair is the color of sun-ripened wheat, and she wears a gold crown set with diamonds. You ought to get along with her very well. Therandril brightened perceptibly at the description, but said, Everyone expects me to rescue you. As long as you defeat a dragon and rescue a princess, no one will care. Cimorene said firmly. And Therindril will suit you much better than I would. Are you sure her dragon isn't female too? Positive, Cimorene said. Gornal's caves 2 down over and 3 below. If you follow the path outside, you can't miss it. He ought to be now, and if you leave right away, you'll be able to get everything settled before dinner. All right, then, Therandril said, as long as you're sure you don't mind. Not at all, Cimorene assured him, fervently. She saw him go to the mouth of the cave and pointed him towards Gonald's cave, then returned to the kitchen. She gathered up the jars and bottles she had been planning to check, except for the copper jar with the gin inside, and took them back to the treasure vault. Then she fetched an ink pot, a quill pen, and a sheet of paper from the library, and began writing out a warning to attach to the copper jar. She didn't want anyone else to open it until the 83 years were over and the jinn could go home without killing anyone. She was just finishing when she heard Eleonora's voice calling from the rear of the cave. I'm in the kitchen, she shouted. Come on back. You're always in the kitchen, Eleonora said, when she poked her head through the door a moment later. Or the library. Don't you ever do anything but cook and read? Look at this, Eleonora, Cimorene said, handing her the warning she had been writing. Do you think it's clear enough? Warning. This jar contains a jinn who will kill you if you let him out too soon. Do not open until at least 105 years after the date which the citadel of the Yellow Giant was destroyed. Eleonora read out loud. Yes, let's see. 84 years from now, it seems clear to me. You'd have to be pretty stupid to ignore a warning like that. Maybe I should show it to Helena and see what she says, Cimorene said, frowning. I wouldn't want anyone getting into trouble by accident just because I didn't make it plain. It's plain, Eleonora said. Cimorene, what on earth have you been doing? How do you know there's a gin in this bottle? Therandril, Cimorene said, waving a hand expressively. I was looking through some of the bottles from Kazul's treasure room to see if any of them happened to have hen's teeth in them, and Therandril came in and wanted to help. Oh, and he opened it? Eleonora said. Oh, dear. Exactly, said Cimorene. But it came out well in the end. I think I've gotten rid of him for good. I sent him off to rescue Therindril. You did? But what if he doesn't beat Gornal? Oh, he'll win. The jinn gave him a wish, and he wished to defeat a dragon. Cimorene looked apologetically at Eleonora. I suppose I ought to have sent him to rescue you, but that's quite all right, Eleonora said hastily. Getting rid of Therindril will help a lot, and after everything you've told me about Therandril, I don't think I'd want him to rescue me. That's what I thought, Cimorene said. Oh, and I got the jinn to give me some powdered hen's teeth, so we can finally try the fireproofing spell. Good, Eleonora said. Let's do it right now. So Cimorene got out the spell and the ingredients she had collected, and she and Eleonora spent the next hour on various necessary preparations. First, they had to boil some unicorn water and steep the drained wolfsbane in it. Then, the mixture had to be strained and mixed with the hippopotamus oil and the powdered hen's teeth. Cimorene did most of that, while Eleonora ground up the blue rose leaves and the piece of ebony. Grinding the ebony took a long time, but fortunately they didn't need much. When Eleonora finally had enough, Cimorene mixed it with the blue rose leaves and more of the unicorn water in one of Kazul's recently shed scales. Each mixture had to be stirred 3 times counterclockwise with a white eagle feather. Then Eleonora dipped the point of the feather in her mixture and began drawing a star on the floor of the cave. Is this going to be big enough for the both of us? She asked, scratching busily at the stone with the tip of the feather. I think so, Cimorene answered. Don't try and make it too big, or you'll run out of liquid and we'll have to start over. Eleonora did not run out, though she had used nearly all of the mixture by the time she finished. There, she said. She sat back on her heels and studied her diagram to make sure there were no gaps, and then set her dragon scale and feather aside and stood up. Your turn. First, we have to get into the center of the star, Cimorene reminded her. Be careful not to smudge the lines. Smudge them after all that work? Eleonora said in tones of mock horror. She lifted her skirts and stepped carefully into the middle of the diagram. Cimorene followed, carrying a small mixing bowl half full of something that looked like brown sludge with a white eagle feather sticking out of one side. It smells awful, Eleonora said, grimacing. It doesn't matter what it smells like, as long as the spell works, Cimorene said. Ready? As ready as I'm ever going to be, Eleonora replied, shutting her eyes and screwing up her face, as if she expected to have a glass of cold water poured over her head. Cimorene plucked the eagle feather out of the bowl and raised it quickly over Eleonora's head before it could drip on the floor. She let 4 large drops of the brown gunk fall onto Eleonora's hair, and then brushed the end of the feather across her forehead twice. She had finished by drawing a circle with the feather on the palm of Eleonora's left hand. That tickles, Eleonora complained. Well, you can do it to me now, Cimorene said. Eleonora took the bowl and feather from Cimorene. You're right, Cimorene said a moment later. It does tickle. Now what? Eleonora said. Set the bowl down and shut your eyes, Cimorene instructed. When Eleonora had done so, Cimorene closed her own eyes and said, Power of water, wind, and earth, turn the fire back to its birth. Raise the spell to shield the flame by the power that we have tamed. Oh, said Eleonora, that feels peculiar. Can I open my eyes now? Yes, said Cimorene, opening her own. We're finished. Did it work? Eleonora asked, cautiously opening one eye and squinting at Cimorene. Well, something happened. We both felt it, Cimorene said. And your hair and forehead don't have brown gunk on them anymore. Eleonora promptly opened both eyes and studied Cimorene. Neither do yours. What does that mean? It means we go back to the kitchen and test it, Cimorene said. She bent over and picked up the mixing bowl. We'll clean up later. Come on.